Has this ever happened to you? You just got into Gears of War. Maybe you played the campaign, maybe you've done some PvE like Horde and stuff like that, but now you're like, I want to try Gears multiplayer, I want to see what that's all about. And you get in there, you start playing your first match, and then this happens. Now, if this kind of thing has happened to you, don't feel bad. This happens to literally everybody who has ever tried to play Gears multiplayer. See, the thing is, Gears multiplayer is unlike any other shooter out there. It really is its own beast, and it has a very high learning curve that seems very against what you think Gears is like when you start playing the PvE modes. So a lot of people bounce off of it very quickly because they just have no idea what's going on or how you're supposed to be playing. But believe me when I say that if you can figure out how to play it, Gears multiplayer is extremely fun. So, very first thing we gotta get out of the way, sensitivity. If you're playing on a controller, you need to increase your sensitivity. The default sensitivity does not cut it for Gears of War. It is literally too slow to play properly, and I'll explain why a little bit later on. But for now, just know that you gotta increase your sensitivity. I know some people find it difficult to go up to higher sensitivities, but really it just takes an adjustment period to get used to the higher sensitivity. Just try to stick with it. Eventually you will become comfortable. Personally, I would say you want to have at least 25 for your normal camera aiming and your target aiming, and your zoom aiming can pretty much be whatever, it doesn't really matter that much. Now, on to the more substantial stuff. All of that cover-based shooting that you learned in the PvE modes of Gears, you know, get in cover, use your rifles, shoot guys as they pop out over cover, you're gonna have to kinda forget all that stuff that you learned. I mean, not all of it. Cover-to-cover combat is still important in Gears multiplayer, but it is nowhere near as critical as it is in PvE modes. Reason being is that the cover-to-cover combat in Gears works primarily because of how the enemy AI works. They will typically stay behind cover and pop out over it and, you know, shoot you from a distance. But people don't do that. People don't play like that when they play Gears of War. Other players are going to try to rush you, and in that situation, staying in cover and just trying to lancer them down is not going to get the job done. You're going to need to learn how to fight up close and personal. And there's two huge factors that contribute to close quarters combat in Gears that you're going to have to learn. First of which is movement. And I know for a lot of people that probably sounds pretty weird, because you don't normally think of Gears as a very movement-focused game. It's normally you get in cover and then you just shoot at guys without doing a whole lot of moving around. It's very stationary generally. But actually, Gears has a lot of movement mechanics to it that are very in-depth and very complex, and Gears is actually an incredibly fast-paced game if you know what to do. Now, I'm gonna assume that you've already played a fair amount of Gears up to this point, so you have the basics down, so I don't need to explain the dodge roll, or roadie running, or active reloads, or any of that stuff. You got the basics down. Now let's talk about the more advanced things that pertain mostly to multiplayer. And the most important movement ability you have in Gears of War is this: getting into cover. Specifically, getting into cover. You know that brief little window of time after you hit the button to get into cover where your character magnetically slides into place? That is what it's all about. As it turns out, sliding into cover is the fastest way to move in Gears, and so it becomes your best tool for moving around and your best tool for avoiding enemy fire. So learning how to utilize the cover slide properly is critical. And I'd say the first important thing that you need to learn to cover slide properly is the maximum range you can be away from a piece of cover in order to trigger a cover slide, because if you're too far away from anything and you try to do it, then you're just going to end up doing a dodge roll, which is not something you want to do in multiplayer that much. It has its applications here and there, but generally it's a pretty bad thing to do because it has this long recovery period at the end of the roll where you can't do anything and you're basically just a sitting duck. The advantage of the cover slide is that it gives you all of the speed of doing a dodge roll, but you don't have that cooldown at the end and you're free to do whatever you want. So try to get a feel for this range right here. This is the maximum possible distance you can be from a piece of cover in order to slide into it. Just kind of experiment a little bit, push it a little bit further and further and further until eventually you start doing a dodge roll, and then pull it back a little bit and practice that exact maximum range you can be away from cover. Not that you always have to do cover slides from the maximum distance possible, it's just good to know what that range is so you have that available and you know what your options are in various different situations. You should also note that cover sliding is not limited to just the things that are in front of you. You can cover slide to things to your sides and even behind you, though they do have different ranges depending on the angle they are in your field of vision. If things are to the side, then you can't snap to them as far away as you can when they're in front of you. Again, just experiment and get a feel for all of the different ranges at all the different angles so you really have an understanding of when you can go into cover and when you can't with all of the cover in your surroundings. Once you have the basics of cover sliding down, then we can go into cover canceling. You actually don't have to do the full cover slide all the way up to the piece of cover you're snapping to. If you just try to move in the opposite direction of where you're sliding, you'll stop. This is what I was talking about before when I said that cover sliding is better than rolling because you don't have that recovery period. At any time during your cover slide, you can just cancel it, and then you're basically back to neutral and you can do anything. It's a way to move a decent distance at a good speed without sacrificing the ability to defend yourself. And from here, we can go into wall bouncing, because since cover canceling sets you back to neutral and you can do whatever you want, you can do another cover slide. So you can do a cover slide, cancel it, and go directly into another cover slide, and you can basically just repeat that process, and in doing so, you will move in an incredibly erratic, very fast way that is very difficult to keep track of and get shots on. In the right hands, this can be a very powerful technique for avoiding enemy fire and closing the distance. And to be clear, I should mention that I am not like a super amazing Gears of War player. You're not going to see like insane crazy movement from me or anything ultra fancy or stuff like that. I know the basics and I have an understanding of how to play, and I do my best. But just keep in mind that once you get a grasp of the things that I'm explaining in this video, you can take them much further than what I'm able to show you. These mechanics are incredibly deep, and you can get really freaking good at them if you want. But actually, we've already covered pretty much all of the movement mechanics. There's really not that much here, it's just that what's here has so much to it. Depending on how you use these mechanics, you can do incredible things that other players couldn't even fathom. It all comes down to taking these movement mechanics and using your skill to apply them in combat in whatever way you think works best. The only other stuff for movement that I want to touch on is not necessarily advanced, but it's things that I think a lot of players don't know exist if you don't get told, so I just want to quickly cover them. So you know how when you're up against a piece of cover that's thin enough you can mantle over it? But that animation is pretty slow actually. But there is a way to quickly mantle over things that most people don't know. If you're roadie running or cover sliding up to a piece of cover that you can mantle over, if you hit the melee button, then you will transition from whatever animation you're doing into a quick vault that you can do to get over things, and you can also use this to get up onto little steps. It's just a nice little trick to speed up your mantling. Also, when you're up against a piece of cover, if you hold A on controller and then move, then you'll do like a roadie run up against cover type thing in order to keep yourself protected, but also move pretty fast. Another minor thing I want to cover real quick is that when you're up against a standing piece of cover, on controller you can click the left stick and your character will go into the crouching stance, which can be useful in certain situations. If like there's a sniper and you don't want to get headshot, moving your head up and down and stuff like that can be useful in the right situation. So that covers movement. Now we can move over to the other key piece of Gears close quarters combat, and that is learning to properly use your Gnasher shotgun. Oh what, you thought the Lancer was the iconic weapon of Gears of War? No, no, no! It's all about the Gnasher, baby. The Gnasher is the most important weapon in all of Gears multiplayer. You need this all the time. Like, when you're playing Gears multiplayer and you're going to grab a power weapon, you ditch your Lancer for it. You do not let go of your Gnasher. This thing is your lifeblood. And on the surface, it might seem like the Gnasher is no different than any other gun. Like, what makes this one so special? Why is it so important? Well, it's really about how the Gnasher interplays and combines with all of the movement mechanics that is so important. So, first things first. Aiming with the Gnasher? Stop doing that. The problem with aiming your Gnasher is that as long as you're holding your aim on something, your movement speed is slowed dramatically, and that makes you a much easier target to hit. Because you gotta remember that everybody starts with a Gnasher, and so if you get into range where you can Gnasher your opponent, they can also Gnasher you, so avoiding enemy shots becomes super important, especially with how high damage the Gnasher can be at close enough of a range. So slowing down your movement speed just a little bit to aim will be your death in a Gnasher fight. In order to excel with the Gnasher, you're gonna have to get comfortable with hip firing, and that means getting a feel for where guns fire in Gears of War, because Gears, as being a third-person shooter, your shots don't actually come out of the middle of the screen like they do in first-person shooters. They actually do come out of the barrel of the gun. So to hipfire correctly, it's not just a matter of putting your enemy in the middle of the screen and firing without aiming. You need to put them in the right position lined up with your gun, which is about right here on the screen. However, for longer shots, if you do need that extra precision from aiming, then what you want to do is what's called pop shotting, where you basically just put your camera centered on the enemy from hipfire, and then basically aim and fire at the same time. This will give you that extra accuracy, but it'll only cut your movement speed for a fraction of the second, kind of giving you the best of both worlds. Also, because your shots do actually come out of the barrel, if you're standing in front of a piece of waist-high cover, you might want to aim just because it makes your character lift their gun up higher so you can shoot over the cover. Another more advanced piece of Gnasher tech that's good to know is that even though your shots do come out of the barrel of the gun, they always do shoot forward in the direction that your camera is facing, even if that means that your shots are coming out of your gun sideways. It's a very weird thing about Gears, but it is how it works. If you look at this in slow motion, you can see that even though my gun is pointing off to the side, the pellets it fires are in fact shooting forward, and you can manipulate this intentionally to do some really fancy shooting. For example, you can fire while doing the little corner cut animation when you're up against cover, and while your gun is pointed basically at the floor, it will still fire forward, and you can use that to quickly round a corner and shoot an enemy at the exact same time. I'm not particularly good at this technique, so in this example, I waited a bit longer than I needed to. You can pretty much fire the moment you start to round the corner, and all of your pellets will go forward and hit the guy on the other side. Most of the time, you do have to kind of time it correctly. Similarly, if you're up against a piece of cover, especially if you're left-facing, and then you back out of that cover, your character will quickly flip to the neutral animation, and you can fire while you're doing that flip animation and make you shoot in really weird-ass directions that you would not normally be able to otherwise. So when you start to really get the hang of things, you can experiment with these sorts of animation locks that the game puts you into for various actions, and how that moves around the barrel of the Gnasher and firing at specific moments, allowing you to do really crazy and out-there shots. To be honest, this is something that I personally don't even really know how to do that well and use very rarely. But players who are better than me use that stuff all the time, and it is really difficult to deal with. And in terms of using the Gnasher, that's pretty much everything. But there's a lot more to the nature of Gnasher duels. When you and another player are up against each other and you're fighting with your Gnashers, there is a lot to consider about the duel itself. Most important of which is the rate of fire of the Gnasher. The Gnasher shotgun is a one-fire gun. Every time that you fire the weapon, you have to pull the lever in order to be able to fire it again, and there is a very specific timing of how frequently you can fire Gnasher shots, and that is basically the heartbeat of a Gnasher duel. Play Gears for long enough, and the exact fire rate of the Gnasher is something that will become second nature to you, and at that point you can really start to manipulate that in how you orchestrate Gnasher duels with other players. Because essentially, once the player fires their Gnasher, as long as it doesn't kill you, they basically are harmless to you until they are able to fire their Gnasher again. Which means the only moments that you're in danger is when your opponent can fire their Gnasher. And this is where all that movement stuff that we talked about before really comes into play, because once your opponent is ready to fire their Gnasher, you need to be able to dodge it and hit them with your Gnasher shot. And there are just so many ways to do this. But for example here, using something I showed off, watch as my opponent comes to shoot me, and I do a little cover slide and cancel to dodge their shot and fire right back at them. This is Gnasher dueling. Getting in close with your opponent and playing the game of how to avoid their Gnasher shots and land shots of your own. Movement is critical. Being able to avoid your opponent's shots means a lot more than being able to land your own shots. And it doesn't always have to be fancy stuff. Sometimes strafing left and right with the right timing is all it takes to avoid the opponent's shots. Because as you start moving left, your opponent starts tracking your movement, but right when they become able to fire their Gnasher, you start moving right, you're not going in the direction they were expecting you to, and so they miss their shot and now you can shoot back at them. As a matter of fact, this simple left and right movement in order to avoid enemy shots is a thing that's prevalent in most shooters, but it's especially prevalent in Gears of War because of the high amount of health that you have and the ability for fights to extend for long periods of time. It gives you many opportunities to avoid enemies' shots, where in other games you might die in, a second or two. In fact, if you and your opponent are both better at avoiding shots than you are at landing them, you can have Gnasher duels that go on for extended periods of time. I've had duels like this, in fact, where me and my opponent both end up having the fight go on long enough where we both run out of shots in our Gnashers and have to reload mid-fight, and it still keeps going on past that. All of the intricacies and complexity and depth that goes into the movement system in Gears really shines when it comes to Gnasher duels because of how critical any single shot can be in those duels. Missing just one shot can make or break a fight, and so being able to avoid even one shot is super important in Gnasher dueling. Another little movement technique that I didn't mention before because it mainly is useful for Gnasher dueling is what I call micro roadie runs, where if you don't have any cover nearby that you can use to cover slide and avoid shots, your next best option is to do tiny little roadie runs right before your opponent is able to fire at you. Just roadie run to the side and then stop immediately, and basically just pray that that's enough to get them to miss their shots. You might also be able to get away with this after a roll if your opponent is a little bit slow to punish your roll's recovery, and you might end up saving your life that way because they're not expecting you to suddenly jerk into a random direction. The same can apply for mantling over cover because it has the same issue where you're vulnerable for a brief period of time after the mantle, and maybe in some situations the roadie run can save your life. Oh yeah, and by the way, in case you didn't know, you can roadie run in any direction, just point the stick as you hold the button. You don't always have to roadie run forward. Just figured I'd throw that out there in case anybody didn't know that. But actually, on the topic of hoping you can make your opponent miss their shots with your movement, that is why it was so important to up your sensitivity, is because when people are moving this quickly and this erratically right next to you, if your camera speed is not high enough, then you will literally not be able to turn your camera fast enough to keep up with enemy players. Whereas if you have your camera speed set high enough, then even if a player does try to do some clever movement in order to get you to miss, as long as you can react to it fast enough and track their movement, you can do that. And don't underestimate the value of cover when it comes to Gnasher duels. While movement is great, you know what's a really good way to avoid your opponent's shots? Putting a wall between you and their shots. Of course, with the amount of movement in this game, it's very easy to get around your opponent's cover, and so just sitting in cover is not what you want to do, but you want to dynamically move around cover in order to do your best to keep yourself out of your opponent's line of sight, and basically wrestle with them around cover until you get yourself into an advantageous position. Which then brings us on to the next important piece of Gnasher dueling, right-handed advantage. Everybody in Gears of War by default is right-handed. They hold their gun with their right hand and have their gun on their right side. And remember, in Gears, your shots actually come out of the barrel of your gun, which means that if you're fighting your opponent and they're on your right, and that means that they are looking at you and you are on their left, you have right-handed advantage. So check this out. Sometimes the best way to use cover is to not actually, go into cover and instead just walk up against a wall. And if I have the wall to my left, and I want to peek out so that way the barrel of my gun is shooting outside of the wall, I only have to move this much in order to make my shots able to go around this piece of cover. But if I have the cover on my left, then I have to move basically my entire body out of the cover where I'm now exposed and vulnerable to getting shot in order to get my barrel all the way on the far right of my character to actually shoot. This is again something that you and your opponent can wrestle for during Gnasher duels, is trying to get that right-handed advantage. You want that advantage as much as possible because it makes you much more powerful in the Gnasher duel when you're working around cover. But at the same time, you can manipulate your opponent's lust for that right-handed advantage and kill them in unexpected situations. Though, if you really want a way to circumvent right-hand advantage, there is something you can do. So if you go on a piece of cover and you face to the left of it and then aim, and then walk away from the cover without releasing your aim, then your character will hold their gun on their left side. And as long as you hold your aim, you will continue to hold your gun on your left side. So in some situations, you can use this to shoot around the left side of cover without exposing yourself as much. Another big part of Gnasher fighting is the gib range. If you get close enough to your opponent, then the Gnasher won't just do damage to them and down them, it'll just flat out completely kill them, regardless of anything. You can kill someone from full health to instantly dead if you're close enough and if your aim is on point enough where enough of your pellets connect with your opponent. But as enticing as insta-gibbing your opponent is, don't go too overboard with trying to gib every single time you get into a Gnasher fight. Gibbing, like everything else, is a tool to be used in the right situation. Because the thing about gibbing is that if you can gib your opponent, they can also gib you, so it's an extremely high-risk, high-reward thing to do. The ideal thing to do is either A, gib your opponent before they can gib you, but, you know, that's a bit of a risk, or B, as I said before, in between Gnasher shots, your opponent is totally harmless. So ideally, you want to try to get inside gib range while your opponent is in between shots and kill them. This is actually a good way to win a Gnasher fight if you're at the health disadvantage, because if you land the first shot in a Gnasher fight and you have more damage done to your opponent than they have done to you, since you're both using Gnashers, they both have the same rate of fire, they can't possibly do more damage to you than you can do to them first, because you're going to get to fire again first. Which is why if you have the health advantage, it's actually best to stay away from your opponent. Keep range as far as possible, so that way you can just basically beat them in the DPS race. But if you are on the back foot when it comes to health, then your best course of action at that point is to try to close the gap and try to gib them instantly, basically removing the health factor entirely from the fight. Of course, you don't have to do that if you're at a health disadvantage. You can always just retreat from a fight. I think it's very important to know that keeping yourself alive is more important than getting kills. But even beyond that, if you are at the health disadvantage, all it takes is one good dodge, and now you can have the advantage on health again. So it's always kind of in flux. Everything when it comes to Gnasher dueling is circumstantial. There is no one-size-fits-all trick that'll get you to win every single Gnasher fight you end up in. It's all about just the current situation. Where are you? Where's your opponent? Who has more health? What's the cover situation? How's your movement? How's your opponent's movement? How's your aim? How's your tracking? All of these factors. And you just have to try to, as quickly as you can, consider all these factors and make really fast decisions and just try to react to what your opponent is doing. And to a degree, if you can, predict what your opponent is doing or bait them into things that are stupid that they end up getting themselves killed in. A good example of that is right here. I see that there are multiple enemies and I'm by myself, so I'm like, this is a bad idea to engage this directly. I retreat and get on this piece of cover. When I'm on this piece of cover, I know my opponents are going to want to come close the distance and get up in my grill. And what's the best way to move? It's cover sliding, but the only thing to really cover slide on is this piece of cover here. So before my opponent even does it, I predict that he's going to cover slide up to the piece of cover I'm up against, and I go around it and shoot him right as he slams up against it. And if this all looks intimidating, keep in mind that I've been playing Gears for many, many, many years, so I've had a lot of time to experiment and figure this kind of thing out. You don't need to be at my level right off the bat in order to do well in Gears multiplayer. You just need to know that these things exist and just try to do them. Try these things, and you'll probably fail and get killed a lot, but as long as you keep trying, you will eventually figure out how to do these things correctly, and you will start getting kills, and you will start doing well. I know for a lot of people, Gears multiplayer is extremely off-putting and intimidating. It can often feel like you're a guppy swimming in a pond of sharks, because everybody else seems to already know this stuff, and you're just left clueless, and you're basically just getting killed left, right, and center, and you don't even know what to do. But hopefully, after watching this video, you have a little bit better of an idea of what's going on, and you can try to start implementing more advanced techniques into your play, and hopefully you can start to enjoy Gears multiplayer, because personally, I think this is one of, if not the best multiplayer shooters that have ever been made. I cannot get enough of Gears. It is just so much fun. If you want a no-stress environment where you can practice all this stuff, then I recommend going into Horde mode and using one of the shotgun-focused classes like the Infiltrator, and just try practicing this stuff. Try wall bouncing, try hip firing, try doing crazy cool movement stuff, try avoiding, the AI shots with cool dodging and stuff. You can do it to a capacity, but the AIs, they kind of cheat and have perfect aim. But you can at least practice it. Though I wouldn't say that, outside the game practice is absolutely necessary to learn how to play Gears of War. Personally, I figured all of this stuff out just in matches, just by playing, and that's how I would recommend trying to learn. But, I understand that different people like to learn in different ways, and that's totally fine. You do whatever works for you. And by the way, even though this video was very Gnasher-centric, don't think that means that the Lancer is useless in Gears multiplayer. A lot of players, even people that have been playing Gears for a long time and know their stuff and are very good, completely disregard the Lancer in the multiplayer when they really shouldn't. The Lancer is a very powerful tool, but just like everything, it has its situations where it is a good choice and situations where it is a bad choice. The Lancer is very good for, mid to long-ish range fighting, but you're definitely not going to be taking people down across the map from the Lancer. But other things that the Lancer are really good for is locking down enemy movement. If an enemy is just outside of what would be effective Gnasher range, then you can just hammer them down with the Lancer, and they will not be able to close the distance on you before they get downed by your Lancer fire. So you can either do that to stop people from rushing you, or to prevent them from even approaching in the first place, which can be very useful for objective-type game modes and stuff. Though, keep in mind, players that know how to move can make themselves very difficult targets to track and hit with a Lancer, and they can manage to close the distance if you aren't able to track them. But with enough time, even people that have really good movement can be Lancered down if you practice it enough. And of course, the Lancer is very useful for support fire. If you see that your teammates are in the middle of a fight, just shooting your Lancer at the enemy while they're fighting can be a big help and save your teammates in lots of situations. Another thing that should be stated about the Lancer, and pretty much all bullet-type weapons in Gears, is always aim for headshots, especially in Gears 5. Headshots make such a difference on how quickly you can take down enemies. You should literally be aiming for headshots with every single shot of a bullet-fired weapon in Gears of War, period. I know that sounds pretty tough, but it's actually not that bad, because these are some pretty beefy dudes with some pretty big heads. So no, it's not just Gnashers all day, every day. There's plenty of room for cover-based Lancer fire as well in Gears multiplayer. You just gotta be able to identify what is the right situation for the right type of play. Before I go, two more quick little pieces of information that I want to give is, number one, spot. Spot your enemies all the time. If you ever aim down sight, just click the left stick and you'll spot your enemy, and that can be really, really valuable because it lets you see your opponent's movement if they go behind a wall or see through smoke, and it also alerts your teammates to their position. They can see their movement for a couple of seconds. It is just so valuable, and there's literally no reason not to do it every single time you aim down sight. Spotting is great, do it all the time, not enough people do it. And also, another thing that people don't do enough of, revive your goddamn teammates. I don't know what it is with Gears players, but for some reason, they just cannot acknowledge when their teammates are down on the floor next to them. They will just ignore teammates all the time and just let them get killed. Like, don't just blindly go for revives, because you can end up getting both you and your teammate killed if there are enemies nearby. But if you have the opportunity to save your teammate, please do it, because way too many people just ignore their down teammates and get them killed for no reason. Oh yeah, one final thing that I have to say is that a lot of times you're gonna feel very cheated out of kills, and you're gonna feel like the game cheated when you got killed a lot of times, because the way that Gears compensates for lag sometimes has you looking at the kill cam going, I don't know about that one, ref, but that's just kind of how it is. Sometimes when you're playing Gears, you're just gonna have to take some bullshit. Just don't take it too seriously, and it'll be fine. Anyway, that's everything I wanted to say. Hope this helps you get a little bit more into Gears multiplayer. I think it's really fun, and I think if you put in a little time to learn, I think you can come to really enjoy it as well. Thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed. See you next video.